Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for today's talk, Human Governing and Well-Being, a Global Investigation with the Coalition for Archaeological Synthesis with Dr. Gary Feinman. I'm Maggie Owens-Sorgan, the Public Program Manager at the Amerind Museum. And as always, before we begin our program, we would like to acknowledge that the Amerind is located in southern Arizona, on lands where the Otham, Hopi, Zuni, Yoemi, and Apache families have lived for untold generations, whose wisdom and traditions live on today in vibrant communities. We are very grateful for what all of these communities rich in history have to teach us. We would also like to thank our members and donors who enable the Amerind to provide these free online programs and to fulfill Amerind's mission to foster and promote the knowledge and understanding of the Native peoples of the Americas through research, education, conservation, and community engagement. To learn how you can assist the Amerind in supporting its mission by becoming a member or donor, please visit amerind.org. Our next online talk will be on Saturday, September 27th at 11 a.m. Arizona time, One Shirt at a Time, Serrating Ceramics from the Palo Parado, an important pre-colonial site near the Arizona-Sonoran border, with scholar Dr. Hunter Claypatch. And for anyone in the area, we have a number of on-site events scheduled, including a night sky event on September 11th and our annual Autumn Fest coming up on October 25th, where we'll be celebrating the autumn for this day-long event. So please check out our website for more details. The recording of today's program will be sent to all our registrants and available to watch on our YouTube channel, hopefully later this evening, if not in the coming days. Today, if you have any questions for Dr. Feinman, please type them in the Q&A and we'll get to as many as possible after his talk. We're happy to have Dr. Gary Feinman today, and he will be speaking about his current research with his international team of social scientists with the Coalition of Archaeological Synthesis. They are examining dozens of ancient societies on several continents with the goal of better understanding of how the governing systems humans create affect the practices and well-being of their people. Dr. Feinman is a McArthur Curator of Mesoamerican, Central American, and East Asian Anthropology at the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago, Illinois. Dr. Feinman presently co-directs 2 international archaeological field projects in Mesoamerica and China. Earlier in his career, Dr. Feinman had leadership's role in the Valley of Oaxaca, and I'm probably mispronouncing this, the Ejutla Valley Settlement Pattern projects, and supervised residential excavations at 4 sites in the region. For 30 field seasons, he has been co-directing field work in China's eastern Shandong Province. So now please welcome Dr. Feinman.
Good morning and good afternoon, and depending on where you are this fine day. Thank you so much, Maggie, for your very generous, kind introduction and for the opportunity to speak. I am really happy to be here and have this opportunity to talk with all of you. I would like to thank the Amerind Foundation, the Coalition for Archaeological Synthesis, and the Field Museum for supporting and facilitating today's event and this project. I am also grateful to you, the audience, for your interest, attendance, and especially your support of the Amerind Foundation and its mission. I also beg your indulgence, as in part my talk today is a bit of a personal journey from a lifetime of archaeological fieldwork that I've been lucky enough to do in Mexico and China to coordinating the synthetic project. In following this path, I also hope to provide a sneak peek into early findings from a collaborative project that has been the focus of 2 Amerind workshops. And I also aim to provide an example of the iterative process of research that has marked my journey on this theme. The Amerind Foundation has had a pivotal role in my intellectual trek. Over those years, it has been my extraordinarily good fortune to be a participant in workshops at Amerind. And these conclaves, quite simply, have been key in those eureka moments between processing data and interpretation that are so critical to stimulating and developing ideas, including my own on human cooperation and governance that I will be speaking about today. I begin my presentation with very brief outlines of two archaeological field programs that, with Linda Nicholas and other colleagues, I have guided and implemented in Mexico and China over the last decades. A key point being that our findings did not always neatly conform with the expectations of entrenched paradigms and common wisdom that were in place when we started concerning the nature of pre-modern economies and governance. And that, along with the data collected by many other scholars, set us on a course to rethink governance, how people organize themselves, its links to economics and financing, and the implications of these processes and cooperative arrangements for human well-being. As background, I acknowledge that even while Linda and I have made dedicated long-term commitments to field projects in two regions, I have always had an interest by training and inclination in framing those projects in terms of broader research questions. Specific regional histories, of course, have great utility, and I have written on them extensively for Oaxaca, Mexico, and Shandong, China. Yet at the same time, I was always aware of the nagging question that is so hard to answer, which is what are our archaeological findings good for? And are they relevant beyond those important local histories? My gut feeling has always been that there are broader meanings that we can draw on from comparative studies. And yet, after decades as an archaeologist, I see even much greater relevance and urgency today as history, science, and perhaps even democracy seem under challenge. For me, the journey began in the Valley of Oaxaca in southern Mexico, where Linda and I began doing systematic regional survey more than 40 years ago, at a time when archaeologists were beginning to ask broader questions about ancient economies and political organization that required advantage beyond individual sites. At that time, the large hilltop center of Monte Alban in the center of the valley had been investigated for decades, but little was known about the rest of the region, and there was sparse context for interpreting the findings from Monte Alban. On survey, we looked for remnants of ancient settlements on the landscape, finding thousands of pre-Hispanic sites across the valley over a 3,000-year time span up to the Spanish conquest and mapping out how they changed in size and location over time. In other words, what we were doing is providing a close to a census for a long sequence of time that archaeologists can discover. Then in the 1990s, we turned to excavations to get more fine-grained information on economic activities and the nature of inequality, with a bottom-up focus on sites and households. We ultimately excavated a series of pre-Hispanic houses at 4 sites in the Valley of Oaxaca and found evidence of production for exchange in almost every house, with variation in the goods produced by households. The domestic advantages were variable from house to house, and although the householders made many of the goods they consumed, they obtained other goods through exchange. In contrast to my training in the comparative archaeology of the mid-20th century, what we were finding did not conform to the notion that governing authorities were necessarily despotic, nor did they control or command the economy of the region directly. Given our survey experience in Oaxaca, we were invited in the mid-1990s to join a multinational team in China to begin a systematic regional survey in southeastern coastal Shandong Province, an area not included or only very minimally so in historical documents. Over 30 years, our international team has amassed a record of thousands of settlements spanning the 3,000-year era from the late Neolithic to the Qin Han Empire, and we found changes in the distribution and sizes of settlements over time that reflect broader patterns in eastern China, including the expansion in the population of coastal Shandong when that area was incorporated into China's first empires, the Qin and the Han. In both regions, Oaxaca and Shandong, our results did not strictly conform with notions regarding pre-modern governance, political economy, or standard neo-evolutionary models. In general, our findings dovetailed with an increasing body of literature and archaeological data that do not align with the entrenched views of the pre-modern past, in which governance was presumed to be uniformly autocratic or despotic based on the control of production and distribution, such that when polities expanded in size, the concentration of power and the degrees of inequality both necessarily grew in concert. Especially for Oaxaca, but also in certain periods in China, our findings indicated that power was not so concentrated and governance was less top down. We can draw several points from our research in Oaxaca and China. In the Valley of Oaxaca, Monte Alban's findings, circa 500 BCE, coincided with an episode of demographic and economic growth in which inequality seems to have actually declined. For example, housing for commoners began to include features that had previously found only in elite houses, such as adobe walls and plaster floors, and less porous grayware pottery, was no longer limited to stylized serving vessels found principally in elite contexts. The city remained the principal center in the Valley of Oaxaca for centuries, with little evidence of personalized exclusionary rule, and there is no indication of centralized storage or the direct political control of production and distribution. In China, there is increasing evidence for shifts in the character of governance during the Bronze and Iron Age. Pre-modern China was not dominated by a string of solely despotic empires, as many have long presumed, and the imperial incorporation of Eastern Shandong during the Qin Han periods was not only a time of population expansion, increased agricultural production, and economic growth, but again, the well-being of broader segments of the population seems to have improved, as represented by the ceramic roof tile, an example of more durable housing compared to earlier thatched roofs. Through our extensive fieldwork in these regions and what our colleagues were finding in others, our commitments to comparative approaches was fostered, while it also became clear that the linear or bilinear, often categorical conceptions of the past that have been in vogue for decades were inadequate to frame our expanding record of variation and change. Much of the long-term conventional thinking is underpinned by the assumptions of the 17th century philosopher Thomas Hobbes, who assumed that humans by nature were atomistic, hence self-sufficient, selfish, quarrelsome, and that larger groups of people could only be achieved through the loss of individual autonomy and the imposition of order through top-down despotic governance. These conceptual frameworks were not grounded in empirical knowledge at the time about the deep past, but thanks to history and archaeology, we now have a much we have much more data about the past, changes over deep time, and these findings in many ways challenge what we thought we knew. Building on Hobbes, the three Karls shown here, Marx, Wittfogel, and Polanyi, have shaped much contemporary thought and general comparative frames in the social sciences that reflect neo-evolutionary, neo-Marxian perspectives. That is, the non-Western pre-modern past was seen as basically Malthusian, despotic, and linear. In contrast, democratic or more collective governance is often seen to have originated exclusively in Athens, Republican Rome, and Western Europe, grounded in the Enlightenment, and from where it was then introduced to the rest of the world. This vision has profoundly shaped the approaches of history and social science to the non-Western world and pre-modern Europe. The perceived differences were seen as so great that distinct bodies of theory, such as Oriental despotism and substantivism and more, were developed to address pre-modern state building outside Europe. As Isfahan and Stockwell's provocative words on the screen compel us to ask, was human cooperation and governance in the past so categorically different from the present? Was democracy unique to Europeans? So, roughly 30 years ago, unsatisfied by the apparent lack of fit between these neo-evolutionary models and the findings that were emerging from the study of pre-Hispanic Mesoamerican societies, my colleagues and I began to draw some contrasts and differences. And a good place to start was the array of differences between the ancient central Mexican city of Teotihuacan and its contemporaries, the cities of the classic Maya. I outline this comparison in some detail as these contrasts were instrumental for providing insights into what aspects of government, infrastructure, ritual, and economy tend to co-occur. But I also review them as they illustrate the kinds of archaeological data we are now examining in the more formal analyses that I will get to later. Teotihuacan was much larger in population, denser, and more monumental in its architectural construction than any classic Maya city. So, grounded in neo-evolutionary thought, you would expect more despotic, personalized rulers and greater inequality at Teotihuacan. But in fact, the findings to date are the opposite, and as we will see in the next handful of images. At Teotihuacan, rulers were not named. Important figures often appeared in groups, as seen here on the left. They often were masked, faceless rulers, showing giving away resources. In contrast, classic Maya rulers depicted on stela were highly personalized, named, often revealing evidence of lineal succession directly from parent to offspring. Classic Maya rulers frequently are shown being served, creating fear, or commemorating military success through cruel actions. As we dove deeper in these contrasts, we began to see other practices and institutions that varied in accord with differences in governance. For example, cosmology and fertility are prominent representations on Teotihuacan's censers and polychromes, themes that align with inclusiveness and well-being. My faces tended to portray rulers in courtly activities focused on ruler aggrandizement. Although Teotihuacan was larger in size, denser, and more monumental than classic Maya cities, the classic Maya cities created numerous lengthy written texts which simply do not exist at Teotihuacan. For example, even the rare and small Teotihuacan stone with a glyph at left is unusual. Classic Maya texts mostly glorified and legitimized rulers. We also noted differences that related to infrastructure and access that affected larger segments of the populations at these cities. Socio-spatial arrangements and investments leave architectural clues. More collectively organized places like Teotihuacan on the left tend to have broader thoroughfares. In a sense, they tend to be more legible for the occupants, easier for residents to navigate. Teotihuacan was laid out following a grid plan, whereas at Tikal, the Maya Center, the major routes led to the ruler's residence, a restricted temple, and associated space. At Teotihuacan, the streets are wide, the plazas are large. Open, navigable access facilitates interpersonal communication, enhancing voice as well as economic exchange and information transfer. Large buildings at Teotihuacan often were apartment compounds, which housed numerous domestic units of differential wealth and status. In spite of huge investments in non-residential platforms at Teotihuacan, such as the Pyramid of the Sun, there actually was much greater investment in thousands of residential apartment compounds than in monument architecture. In contrast, large residential structures in the classic Maya region tend to be ruler residences, as seen on the right from Palenque. These house the ruler, their family, and their retinue. Maya commoner residences tended to be small and less durable. At Teotihuacan, no ruler's palace is obvious or has been consensually recognized to date. The differences in governance between Teotihuacan and the classic Maya are also seen in burials. Maya rulers on the right were generally interred below temples and acropoli in very exclusive, restricted locations. In death, as in life, they were accompanied by highly valued and highly crafted adornments. Given Teotihuacan's size and monumentality left, archaeologists operating under traditional assumptions have tunneled under the site's three largest temples and pyramids looking for elaborate ruler graves. And so far, what they have found are sacrificial victims, caches of marine shell, and other offerings. Autocratically or less collectively ruled polities like the classic Maya were characterized by elite control of exchange routes, such as navigable rivers, where highly crafted and valued exotics were transferred. Alternatively, more collectively organized centers, such as Teotihuacan and Monte Alban, were situated where local production and labor were economic keystones. Patterns that we see in governance between more collective political formations versus more autocratic ones also parallels differences in ritual behavior. Depictions of Maya ritual tend to be associated with spectacle, ruler performances, while participatory processions and feasts are more commonly represented at Teotihuacan. Generally, past or present, when power is concentrated in autocratic personalized rulers, the associated rituals tend to focus on that central principle or person and often emphasize glitz and fear. Rituals associated with more democratic political contexts tend to feature synchronized movements, reinforce shared values and cosmologies, and include codified doctrine and elements associated with collective well-being, fertility, and abundance. With these themes, they generally affirm collective identities. As the text on this image outlines, we began to see co-occurrences and behaviors that extended beyond the pairwise comparison of the classic Maya and Teotihuacan. Across Mesoamerica, depictions of rulers provide important indicators of power relations. Those on the left, Teotihuacan, Monte Alban, Tlaxcalan, represent more collectively organized centers. The rulers are masked, unnamed, more modestly attired, and often in sets. They are depicted filling roles in offices. The more autocratic rulers from the classic Maya, the Olmec, the Mixtec in late pre-Hispanic Oaxaca on the right tend to be highly personalized, sometimes named, and larger than life. Importantly, there were changes in governance in various Mesoamerican regions over time, including Oaxaca and the Maya region. So political organization is not simply culturally bound. So 30 years ago, in these co-occurrent patterns across pre-Hispanic Mesoamerica, based on them, my colleagues and I began to scour the literature to look for similar axes of variation in how people govern themselves. And we found that a good number of scholars had completely independently noted similar patterns or dimensions on the left that contrast personalized exclusionary rule versus collective governance. How was power wielded? How rulers were funded and legitimated? We published these observations in Current Anthropology on the right, but at that time we still did not have a clear idea of why these patterns seemed to recur, or more importantly, even why change along this axis took place. Subsequently, key steps in answering those questions were made in two books authored by my colleagues Richard Blanton and Lane Farger. They systematically examined 30 historical cases using variables as you see on the screen of mostly non-Western societies, including Ming China, the Mughal Empire, the early Roman Empire, the Inca of South America, and the Aztec. Drawing on textual sources, they systematically define specific test implications to measure bureaucratic investments and checks on the power of rulers to examine variation in governance along a number of key dimensions, as well as how the institutions of governance were funded in each case. Their 30 cases varied along an axis of democratic to autocratic political formations that roughly mirrored what we found for Teotihuacan and the classic Maya distinctions. Blanton and Farger found consistent patterns of what they called internal resources, that is, taxes and labor drafts that rely heavily on local labor and production, underpin more collective governance and distributed power arrangements. Collective governance was aligned with more legible urbanscapes and fuller bureaucratic infrastructure to collect the taxes and supply those goods and services. Alternatively, external resources, which are more monopolizable, such as spot resources, the control of trading routes, or slave and serf estates, co-occurred with concentrated power, few public amenities, patrimonial henchmen, and little investments in infrastructure. These associated factors form two poles or ends of an axis or continuum. I stress that this axis is derived from data and is not a utopian ideal. So at the more collective pole, the most collective polities were not perfectly equal or egalitarian in power relations or in wealth. Bland and Farger's research provided the conceptual foundation as to why more collective forms of governance would tend to co-occur with meritocratic bureaucratic structures and internal financing, with a key being how these institutions and power were funded. At the same time, the contrast between Teotihuacan and the classic Maya illustrated key differences in pre-Hispanic governance in Mesoamerica. Building on these findings, David Carballo at Boston University and I undertook a more formal comparison of pre-colonial Mesoamerican societies, drawing mostly on archaeological data, but supplementing that when possible with text. We began with a sample of 30 Mesoamerican cities and central places that you see on the map, which we subsequently expanded a bit in later papers. Because this was an early trial with mainly archaeological data, we focused simply on three dimensions that basically aligned with the Blanton-Farger model: variation in governance, architectural and infrastructure factors, and then funding. Drawing on published literature and discussions with colleagues, we ranked each of those dimensions on a 0 to 1 scale. Less collective was 0, more collective 1. So when these scores were summed, each case was ranked between 0 and 3. Collectively governed cases scored around 2 or 3, such as Teotihuacan, while the more autocratic, like the classic Maya cities, scored 0 to 1. As you see in the upper left, for most cases, what Carballo and I called the collectivity scores clustered at one pole or the other, indicating that the 3 dimensions that we coded tended to co-occur in alignment with the Blanton-Farger model. The top left graph also shows that with larger size, polities did not necessarily become more autocratic, contra neo-evolutionary expectations. The top right graph shows that there was no uniform or linear temporal sequence of change in the degree of collectivity or autocracy over time for our Mesoamerican cases. The bottom graph illustrates the relationship between collectivity and governance and the degree of local infrastructural investments, so that more collective governance has greater infrastructural investments. Through our studies of pre-Hispanic Mesoamerican cities and states, David Carballo and I began to see that collective forms of governance were one side of a bipolar continuum with autocracy at the other pole. Key organizational features along this spectrum varied in parallel ways, not only across our Mesoamerican cases, but also with the cases coded by Blanton and Farger. At the same time, political scientists and others have begun to recognize that democracy is not a discrete category or idea with an on-off switch, but to paraphrase Nicholas Kristof in the New York Times, it is one end of a dial or continuous axis with autocracy at the other end. In global surveys that examine and compare governance across contemporary nations, such as by The Economist, VDEM, or Freedom House, key dimensions along this axis include the extent to which decision-making and power were concentrated or distributed, the degree of citizen voice and inclusiveness, the character of governmental functionaries, office holders selected by merit or local retainers, and other dimensions that dovetail remarkably closely with the Blanton-Farger findings and those of David Carballo and myself. These findings seem to offer a potential foundation to use data from the past much more fully to understand political change, because there is not an apparent categorical or fundamental break between pre-modern and modern governance, or seemingly even between Europe and the rest of the world. People are people, and the institutions of human cooperation have parallel constraints, whether past or present. To put it too simply, when we look at the rises and falls of democratic forms of governance today, it may be helpful to draw on findings that extend beyond just a few dozen cases from the last century in the contemporary West, and to be able to consider and synthesize a rich archive of historical regime changes over long time sequences that archaeologists, historians, and other social scientists are beginning to compile and analyze from across the globe. And unlike the present, when it comes to the past, we often know something about outcomes, so we can see how differences in governance relate to other spheres of behavior and well-being. With a wider global data set where we already have information on what happened over time, we can see if these patterns hold. What are the dynamics of governmental transformations? How did forms of governance relate to well-being and inequality? Despite diverse sequences of change, we are starting to define some patterns in governmental diversity along certain continuous axes that not only paralleled other pre-modern contexts, but also correspond with relational patterns that are familiar from more recent and contemporary contexts. And here you see some of the relations that seem to co-occur across the cases and studies. In the current CFAS Amerind project, my colleagues and I are assessing the axis of democratic autocratic governance and its hypothesized relations to institutional funding, mass ritual, the nature of political functionaries, and certain conventions of socio-political behavior. We are examining these links with data we have begun to compile through the CFAS Amerind governance workshops. The intent of these workshops is to refine our prior studies in two ways. One, building a global database. The map shows our current 31 localities, some of which have multiple time horizons. So 40 polities with discrete time horizons compose our current sample. And two, getting more granular on our measurements of government than David and I did, as well as on bureaucracy, financing, and ritual. Undoubtedly, this sizable challenge working mostly with archaeological, this is a sizable challenge working mostly with archaeological data, even where we can amplify with text. And the first steps for our team of regional experts, who are seen watching a well-timed eclipse here, was to compile a series of consistent proxies to capture the key dimensions of governance with archaeological data, which we see as the degree of concentrated power and the relative extent of citizen inclusiveness, which both follows definitions of democracy and what the current studies of contemporary societies look at. In many cases, and we intentionally began with cases well known to our team of experts, the information is in fact available in the archaeological literature to evaluate the proxies in our protocol. But most archaeologists up to now have not viewed from analytical lenses that we are employing. For example, here you see an architectural example of where top-line decisions were made in Athens and Tikal. In Athens, these spaces were large, circular, widely accessible, and conducive for interpersonal dialogue. Where at Tikal, they were small, restricted, dominated by special thrones. Based on a suite of presence, absence, or yes-no proxies, such as the one shown here, and we phrase this as whether top-down decisions were made in small, restricted contexts or more open spaces that allowed for discussion and checks on individual power. We constructed a tiered protocol to score each case along the autocratic-democratic continuum, what we then called the autocracy index. The higher that score, the more autocratic governance was deemed to be. The autocracy score for each case is based on 6 bridging arguments, 4 for the concentration of power and 2 for the degree of inclusiveness, that serve to tally the proxies into one cumulated score. It is worth noting that a quibble over how any one proxy is coded, as there are more than 25, would have relatively little effect on the autocracy score for that case. The autocracy scores are then compared with other coded variables to see that we will see in the next images. Based on the workshops and subsequent coding, our experts have compiled data that are still preliminary, yet they are intriguing. For example, traditionally, variability along the autocratic-democratic axis for pre-modern governance has been thought to closely correlate with the hierarchical complexity of government and the size of polity populations. That is, the larger the polity and its government, the expectation is the more autocratic its rule. But as you see in the 2 figures on the screen, these 2 variables, high complexity and polity population, which both increase from left to right, only explain a small portion of the variability in the autocracy index, for which 6 is the most autocratic score. Other traditional views have equated pre-modern democratic governance exclusively with European history or alternatively, they see pre-modern governance generated in a consistent manner at a uniform timescale following the advent of domestication. But again, for both of these variables, we found no clear relationship. Rather, what our findings do illustrate is that the financing of government, or how rulers or governing institutions obtain their funds of power, does explain a greater proportion of the variability in the autocratic democratic axis, a finding that parallels those of Blanton and Farger. When external funding that can be concentrated or monopolized with little reliance on the labor of the broad citizenry is the key to funding of governance, power tends to become concentrated. And here you see two different ways that we assessed this relationship. And again, in line with the prior analyses I discussed, we found that more collective polities tended to have more meritocratic bureaucracies. Autocratic polities are more likely to have patrimonial functionaries with direct ties and loyalty to the ruler. Another strong relationship in our sample is between principal modes of ritual and governance. Spectacle, ruler-dominated performances are predominant in autocratic cases, while more participatory modes of ritual are more evident in those cases governed collectively. A finding that again parallels what we found when comparing Teotihuacan and the classic Maya. We also found that more democratic or collective forms of governance tended to be linked to lesser degrees of inequality, which we looked at both qualitatively and quantitatively. For the latter, we used Gini indices based on differential residential sizes when the data were available. Our results for that align with an article published last spring in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences by Rao and Stokes on the left that found that democratic forms of governance and lesser degrees of inequality were associated when measured for contemporary nations. Our current findings also align with the findings of a paper that I was the lead author on last spring in the same journal, in which autocratic governance and inequality were again found to be associated. These findings suggest that there are consistent parallels between political and economic relations that can stretch across time. Archaeological publications and knowledge have expanded at an incredible rate since 1960, and especially in the last 20 years, as you see on the left, with many new sources of information opening novel avenues for investigation and comparison. In fact, neither the Gini project nor the current governance study could have been implemented without that marked increment in our empirical record. While we as a field can pat ourselves on the back for this growth of information, our theoretical constructs, frankly, in my opinion, have not kept up. This is unfortunate, as archaeology is getting into an empirical position that would allow us to view the full diversity of and parallels across the global past on their own terms. As we who study the past often know something about outcomes, the complexity of deep time histories has the potential, in my view, for many lessons and correctives. To leverage the tsunami of data that we as a discipline have collected over the last years, new conceptual frames and armatures are necessary to make sense of it, and thereby to provide meaningful guidance for richer and more equitable futures. It is time to put the iterative process of science to work, use what we have learned to tweak, broaden, and enhance our conceptual frames. Our preliminary findings illustrate that neither great degrees of inequality nor autocracy are necessarily inevitable, but they do seem to be related. That when external financing, that is, resources that can be monopolized, funds government, it tends to lead to concentrated decision-making and lesser degrees of citizen inclusiveness. We also found that democratic practice is not really historically unique to Europe or even modernity. These findings seem relevant to how we think about today, the present, and our futures. And so again, as you see the names of my collaborators and co-authors on the screen, I express my deepest gratitude to the Amerind Foundation for the opportunity to bring our team together and investigate this theme of comparative governance. And I thank you all very much for your interest and especially your continuing support of this great institution. So thank you.
Thank you, Gary, for sharing your work. I'll open it up for questions, but one that we have on the more collective governing that may from like Teotihuacan, is there any idea of how they chose their group rulers or masked rulers?
They probably would seem to represent some kind of social segment, but how they're selected uh, within that social segment, we probably don't know. So you may have some kind of council represented by different residential sectors of the site or different social segments, but the specific way of selection is not something we necessarily know. But I don't think um, sometimes people say, well, there's something unique about contemporary governance, and that is that we have elections. But as we are seeing around the world, elections are not a foolproof exemplar for democracy. They themselves can come afoul. So I don't think we should overly emphasize that particular proxy or dimension of governance.
Yeah. Let's see if we've got any. Looks like we don't have any. Oh, wait, here we go. One from Kathleen. I am not clear on what external financing involves versus internal.
Sure. External financing is basically when you're not reliant on a big part of your local populace to derive the financing of governance. So external financing would be means of getting resources that can be monopolized or tightly controlled by a small group of people, those who have power generally. And they could be like a slave estate, a serf estate, the control of spot resources like oil wells or some kind of mining resource, or it could be war booty where you take the booty and it's basically brought to the ruler. So that would be an external resource as opposed to an internal resource, which would be things like farming, taxes on markets, taxes on craft specialization, things that depend on taking a little bit from a wide segment of the population. Generally, internal resources require that because farmers don't want to turn over part of their proceeds or harvest, they require often giving something back or being somewhat controlled in how you exercise power. Whereas if you monopolize the resource that's funding governance, you don't have to worry about giving much back.
Right. And here's one from Jan. Did Teotihuacan type of governance change over time, especially near the end of their life?
Yes, I think it did break down, and I again, it's something we need to know more about. But it looks like there was some kind of significant shift towards the end of Teotihuacan. In fact, almost a rebellion against those who governed because there's selective burning of important institutional buildings at the site towards the end of its uh, sort of apogee. I mean, there's population continues there, but it's of a much lower nature, and the city is much less central in central Mexico. And it looks like power may have become more concentrated in the hands of a few.
And one from,
Monte Alban also broke down at the end of its
oh,
sequence.
okay. One from Barbara. You mentioned differences in how ritual participation was presented in imagery between more and less collective governance. Would you have comments on the implications of human sacrifice in relation to forms of governance, a practice evident in Mesoamerica, among other locations?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think human sacrifice tends to uh, I think it depends on the context of human sacrifice. I don't think I mean, obviously, if it's made part of a big public display, it's a kind of spectacle. But I think other kinds of human sacrifice that, may not have that same effect. So I think it tends to be more related to spectacle, creating fear, but a lot depends on the context in which it happens.
And we have one from Patricia. One of your early slides, you showed Monte Alban as a collective and later Mixtec as in the same region as less collective. How and why do you think this happened?
Uh, I wish I knew the definitive answer to that question. I think what happens is that Monte Alban, towards the very end of its history, after more than 1,000 years, I think begins to break down and power becomes concentrated in certain lords um, as the Monte Alban polity breaks apart. So you get this sort of breakdown of the overall political unit, but also within each of the small units that continued, power is highly concentrated in lords. And that system seems to basically endure up until the Spanish arrival. I think my own view would be that when things break down, one of the key factors is shifts in the nature of financing of power, and that um, both exchanges and inter relations between rulers becomes a bigger part of what finance power, along with at least later in the period, with the establishment of serf-like estates under the Mixtec lords. They had kind of like serf-like population that sort of followed them around. And I think that kind of agricultural system wasn't necessarily in evidence earlier. So more concentrated funding, although we don't really, I mean, all of that is pretty speculative. We don't know. And we need more information on the late period in the Valley of Oaxaca to get a better answer to that question.
So here's one from Donna. Have you considered using current ethnological research to understand governance structures and practices? Examination and analysis of indigenous structures might be enlightening.
Yeah, I think people are doing that. Yes, I think it is. But I mean, I think that is in terms of the mechanics of governance, and we of course do pay attention to that. And we also look at historical records through the Blanton and Farger work. I think that the one thing I would say is that I'm a little bit cautious about relying too heavily on ethnographic analogy, because the societies studied ethnographically are quite changed from what we saw before the 1600s. So I think that I think it's definitely important for getting the range of governance practices, but I would not want to use something like the direct historical approach. I think that's already been tried, and in my view is of limited utility.
Great. I'm going to end with a comment from Connie. Thank you for this talk. You've opened my eyes to a completely new way of appreciating archaeology from a physicist and archaeology buff.
Well, thank you, Connie. I appreciate that.
I'm going to thank you, Gary, for sharing all your knowledge and research, and we look forward to hearing more about what you learn.
Thank you very much.
And thank you.
Thank
Thank you
you.
for everyone who shared your Saturdays with us. And I'll turn it over for Gary for his last words.
Well, I just want to thank the Amerind Foundation for inviting my opportunity to talk to you all. I want to thank you, the audience, for your excellent questions. I appreciate, again, your turning over your Saturday to listen to a few ideas. And I hope that these ideas are soon to find their way into publication. My colleagues and I have every intention to submitting these data to review very shortly. So thank you all, and thank you to Amerind.
Thank you.